We were just talking over tea about tukdam.
제가 단단한주 수지 퍼센트 값을 tukdam 걸 계제 시어인스.
So we were talking about what we were talking about in class. So if any kind of phenomenon that happens to us, whether it's religious or spiritual, has to go through our biological substrate, our cells.
제가 다디 안주기 단지 지나나 시대에 다지가 최초기 시대에 아니 계제인 변을 가리인비나 다 안주다 대화 예외게 아니 내주든주 아니 안주기 네 수부 시기네레 안주 류기 좁자 시기네레 다 쟁의기 아니 다 레가치단 든지 균이 도고야 임바디 아니 다 도구여 was.
So we were talking about tukdam. Even though it seems kind of it is spiritual and difficult to understand, it too has to go through some kind of cellular mechanism.
그래서 당한주 탄다 도담 대하고 계제 시디는 제단디 아니 최초다 되어요다 그가나시 아니 가리 연구에 메시아디 아니 고녀고 시우 진비나야 아니 지기 디기 칠레 다 디기 슈진드조 만주 수부게 다 지기 타붕 림바네 체체 아니 ko deshiga yoam deshiga guyo teoyo chadiyo surustus.
So I was thinking about your question about the seed and the potential that's in the seed, and is the physiology of the seed there even before the water or only after the water? And I was wondering if maybe tukdam is like being able to go backwards into the seed and to take all the potential and shut everything down except some kind of consciousness before you die. So like going back in time, it's just an idea.
제가 나랑 삼노 가르코스 라빈비나 안 단지 아니 단다 사베 깜부 임비 네캅슬라 아니 코랑 디크 나로라 아니 차시 상마 상도 요레 마레 니바 요레 마레 세야 딘데 계자 셴바스 제자다 딘데 니바 요레 디 아니 지가 딘데 사베 타비아다 렌다 딘데 체빈비나 몽발라 아니 코랑 유구제 투레 세야 계자 총수와스 그래서 네다 sometimes example 단다 두담기 아니 네다디 디그 도저스로 시도스 당부 안는 안조 레가다 직사 가레 미클라 가르체 되어디 갈레 되네 파파파 친치 아니 요구네 마마체지 사명기 네갑슬라 마 침버스로 제자다 두담 네갑 데디두 삼발라 남균 안조기 아니 레 루기 칠레든조 아니 식체 아니 다 셰베고 니기거 시기네레 간다마다 아니 드름바 디네 망아조 단지 뺄 때비베나 사병 네갑도 요바 소로스도스.
Because now His Holiness the Dalai Lama gave permission to Western scientists, right, to study tukdam. So now, maybe we'll know soon what's going on physiologically to these people that are in that state.
제가 군두가 탄다 tukdam 딩이 든줄라 아니 제바치는 디레스라치 아니 세레바든줄라 아니 다 조전을 마수 제사 아요레 제사 디가는지 콘조기 냠십 제디기어 was. 제가 로카시기 제라 아니 직드네 tukdam 딩이 든줄기 아니 수부기 나로라 고 타붕기 림바네 네갑스 임비나야 아니 레가 카드스 지구메 아니 갈치네 데네 데투유메 세야도 직치나 하고 좀더 거레스.
So it could be one of those interesting areas where Buddhism and science come together to better understand the mind and body connections.
그래서 다데게 페소 든조 아니 나주다 세니 송제 토니 아니 나주 류다 셈 파르키 아니 제베 조당 토라 아니 니주야 신토비아키 아니 펜존 차기어다스.
So at some level, even tukdam has to come down to this.
tukdam dingi imbena korajik jache tabungal ma phable gubiores.
Right? We laugh, and this doesn't explain tukdam, but in order for tukdam to work, it has nothing to work with except this.
제가 디게 아니 tukdam 가진 데 투요레 칸데스 디요르세야티 아니 차상원 데시게마 좀 임베나야 아고 마 밥임베나 타마 아니 타붕 림베 토네 아니 데시게고 아게고 샤고요레스.
So that's why it's so important to understand if we can understand this, which will take still many, many more generations of science. If we can understand this, we can move in this direction, right, towards understanding. And then if we understand Buddhism, we move in this direction. And the hope is that over much time, we come up with the answers in the middle.
제자다 Drepung se di ha gobe Drepung ki lega chedang ha gone an tugdam se di khandis di yore khalchin di yore se di cha sangwa ha mago yimbe na ya Drepung ki ane lega chedang yakbo ha gona ane tugdam dedang khalchin di yome di chola ane ro di yore khajo di chol ro di yore 제자다 대가나시 ane nangju tone ane yakbo ha gu yo na nangju to nangju yakbo 셴빔베나 아니 동담세 ngoyene su kharimidi cho thanye 제가 초 닝가네 아니 소 용빔베나 아니 ngoyene su lesdela 아니 thanyer다 gor leptobe ayongsigres.
So that's why we're spending time trying to understand how slime mold work. Even though slime mold may sound very far away from tukdam, maybe it's not.
제가 다 든데 김전 텐체 ngazo slime mold ki ane lega chedan dinzo ane tangi yordas 직치는 안에 슬라임 몰다 tukdam니 자와니 히네 대와 메교 되네 인시르 되네 직치빈베나야 되네라 인기 말다스 대와 요시르다스.
Okay, so let's get to our homework questions.
제가 가서 낭레기 대월 마치로 갸빈베나.
And those questions had to do with how these cells are changing, right? So they seem to be acting independently, but now they start to act together and interdependent.
대와 당보도 가르슬라나 차bun도 당보 랑가 데디도스 데네 콘조 속바차도스 속바차도다 랑가 임비케 네갑슬라 아니 ngoon jordan khandes jorguyor에 ngoon jorguyor에 마레세디 아니 가상한서 대와 임바스.
Something is different. They're changing their identity.
제가 아니 당봉을 소소소 예베케 네갑스다 타마 아니 소베케 아니 네갑슬라 아니 만다와레 도스 제가 코니 ngo 직바 차고요 마레스.
So those single cells are now multicellular. And they're doing different things. Some cells are here, some cells are there, some cells are there. Suddenly, they become a multicellular organism.
제가 안에 콘조 당봉에는 안에 저분 장바이면에 콘조소 루지 속바디 갈래갈래 수분 교체 안에 콘조 딘데스 차버레스. 링은게 저분 리카시 코 강바 차되어레 카시 코 동보 차되어레 안에 카시 코 고 차도 고 쓰기는레 속 쓰기는 강 동도 차되어레스.
So that's what we're going to think about now at a very basic level. How does this change in identity or differentiation or development, how does that happen?
제가 다 딘데기 안에 콘조 안에 내담 만다와니디 나올 콘조 ngo 칸데스 교두여레 안에 저분도 당부 릭직바 임바 디 안에 타만 타데 차두여바 ngo 교두여바 디 안에 세리 타니라 나도 differentiation series differentiation 세야들라 계란서 규르 나올라 안에 체인주르라니 규르도아 자 안에 소소소 체주 시기네레 체벌 시기네 디 로가 차도야들라 안에 differentiation series.
Okay. So let's think about your homework. So we're moving from So something happens here. We decided it was a decrease in food. Something happens to change the environment. So these cells now begin to change their identity and they start to move towards each other and form a kind of mass of many cells, right?
칼라 메오차레스 메오차타 칼라뉴 타 녜마 요나시 요마레스 디 메오 겸젠테네 콘조 상마 가르치레스 라빈베나 냠두루루 차야 고주고레스.
Okay, and remember that mass of cells can then become a slug. I'm just reviewing yesterday. And then this can either, if it finds food, more food, now it can go back to be single cells, or it can differentiate even further into this stalk.
제가 다들라도 삼발라 아니 칼라 뇽으로 침버레스 칼라 뇽으로 쳐도 삼바 콘주츠 냠도 대야 고주그레스 냠도 대야 고주체 타마 카르차루로 슬라빈베나 소자직 차루레스 소자직 차웨 키네갑들라 탄다 슬락라니 규르도 슬락 식도 콘주 제가 디 차루레스 디 네갑슬라 타고 야마 로디도 파조 로디도 삼발 칼라 라나 양 가시기레 코 코란 토르스 타붕 삼마 토르치 아니 통메 네갑데갈 라마 치시 갸루레스 한도 안고 칼라마라 이나 데갑슬라 안 칸 교두레스 라빈베나 사베 홍올 임베 네단델 교두레스 델라 스웬체란 티두 삼스 도 스웬체라 데체 아니 pajok slag la dala nyang khatidu nyapung.
Okay, so so my question for you for homework, it was actually your question, I think, was what changes between here and here?
Chizata karna nanglechi kina zu khare slavin bena del yewe ke nekabda del yewe ke nekabla ani chebar khariore khandis juwa ina juwa khandis simbre se adres.
So we want to think about all the parts of the cell that we talked about earlier this morning. And what do you think is changing in these parts of the cell between being independent single cells and interdependent grouping cells?
Chizata tamungela ani konzo rawang chichi dediyores. Tama ani konzo rawang mewa penzu ani chigla chig ne dingi ki ani soja tabung soba jik soja jik chawres. Di chawe kapsla dingi phal chebar khayores sidu sambala ane kunini ki chobje ki nanglo la tabung rere ki nanglo la gywa khadugi me di samno taas kunini la ko ki tabung deda ko ki tabung dini ni dorbi be na di nanglo la chashi khar khar la gyur go sare khar khar mandaw yung go sare.
What's changing?
Jig ladas ya khari cheju khari yosar mandaw khari yosar suye me lago jang da ke mangu gyara sangma khana khu amjo khumundo ya gela inda lada khandis dur
ki sabora jon don kora ta khala no me di chani ta ni ki dis re mangu cha ki ibaro te ya ke
nuji on man go re nyun go dinon re. So since this individual has more cells and I think he's talking about bigger size, so he needs to produce more energy. So maybe the cells they are started producing more mitochondria.
Okay, that's an interesting idea. The problem here is what's the signal to start this? What's the signal to start the change from single cell to multi-cell?
Dene dipa de yorgu duda la ne da khare. Dene ta den ding duda la de khala kharchi re. They have less food.
So if you have less food, you're not going to be able to make more energy because energy comes from food.
Jinso khala mara na khala nyu do bi na niba ma te da ma du re.
Right?
Niba se de khala ni yung was.
So that's not going to work. We have to think about something else. But I think you're on the right path. You're on the right path, but we have to think about the opposite because we're less food, less energy.
Ta jowa khandes du re sidu sambala ende du re da se jowa do thang ke khacho de ta da dexon skiran zu. Ina ya thanda di docho res. Khala nyur chimba res. Ta rosun ta ya di nyu mi shi ma res. Niba di peju che di nyur tang res. Ta di mai ban jowa khado sare. Ha Hari Golji led re. Nuji wonder. Lysosome. Maybe there will be a change in lysosome.
Why?
Kaji ni kade sure. Manga ra ore. So compare this with each individuals. They are using more foods. So because of that, they may have more leftovers or end products, which lysosome has to break down and clean up.
Okay, so I think you have an important principle here, and that is if we want to see what's the difference between these cells and these cells, we want to compare them, right? We want to look at them, we want to look at some of their chemical signals, We want to look at all the different things we can think about. So that's an important experiment, irrespective of the answer, to compare these cells to these cells and see carefully what's different about them.
그래서 당주 따야 조디 단진 시에데 카르슬라나 디게 처분 속바 나로 예베게 처분 된주다 데라 라완진이 데드니게 처분 된주 안에 처분 친시 올 때비미나 안에 만다와 카르카리 요사레스 라디 안에 간주키 단다 미유 디로와스.
So it could be lysosomes could be different. Probably their activity is different. I don't know, but we could do the experiment, right? We could look at lysosomes in these single cells, and when they start to group together, and we could see if there's more lysosomes, and we could see if they're more active.
그래서 다들 선발라 단다 라이스 제숙레디 라이수고 숙레디 아니 타야요레스 콘소 망르 친도 뉴르 친도 콘소날마도 디 타야요레스.
What else might be different about?
다디 유미 카리 이밀 마도바 아니 유스티 로스 라이심바 카리우스 라
나 차범 좀바 너무 더 주대야 되나 그런 롱고스에 칼라 미가 그런 거에 다 칼라가는 저도 매번 매번 요소는 내가 예마치야 근데 거기서 파스 야한테 그렇게 해도 쓰는 컨셉 칼라 정말 색 컨트롤 로야 내가 같이 이걸 매번 찍찍 매번 이선 천년도 나네요 찍찍 뭐야 매번
So you probably have to say that in Tibetan.
게랑 코란 칼라스라나 코란 라완진 데데오다 데르 초바 데데오니 체와 카리오레스라나 라완진 데오캅슬라 코란 레가 망부 시오레스 칼라사야 동야 상마수야 상마 코란 치그레스 니버드야 데르 임베나 데네 체오 마레스 니버치니 카시 체두그레 칼라수니 카시 소두그레 디보 손자 아니 코 레가 뉴 요레 아니 니버 페주 체야니 조 뉴 요레스라 데르 마 요레스라. So when these cells are living individually, they have to survive by themselves. That means they have to do multiple works. They have to find food. They have to produce energies. They have to clean up the waste products. And here, since they are working together as a single individual, few of these cells may be responsible for finding food, and few of others are responsible for cleaning up things. So that means if you compare one individual cells, the cells in this group has less activity to do, less work to do, and because of that they need less energy, and so that they can stay alive together.
Oh, good. Okay. So we call that part of differentiation is specialization. So they take on specific functions, right?
다 가서 라인바스 kell랑 단다 라오난시 and changes 야 디키 and 디우 카차 두르스 라미베나 and kunju lega de and lega chiraba chik chinyen cha dures lega mangbo chinyen ne lega chik chinyen ma gyurdu yores 제가 딜라도 잠발라 그 기용 톤 집이면은 그 lega de karchi gyore 뉴 루요레스 땅에만 사야 돈이야 다 제가 줘야 다 소야 다 상마 제구이나 다 사야 미시 lega 메교 제가 줘야 미시 lega 메교 지워송다 아니 그 lega 뉴뉴 차오레스.
So let's think about what that means at a cellular level. What would specialization mean at a cellular level?
그래서 다 딘데기 아니 체인주르기 나로라 아니 첼레베기 아니 레가 친이기 처붕차 루레 세두 삼발라 처붕 코란기 아니 좁제 나로로 요가 카르카 두고 요사레 델 삼단두 카르차 요사 요가 카르 두고 요사 코 첼레바 차 두고 요나 카르차 두고 요사.
Yeah, sure. For example, if your special job was to make more proteins, maybe you have more ribosomes because ribosomes make proteins. Other cells might be involved in energy production, so they might make more mitochondria. So suddenly your cells, like your idea, are going to specialize. So that means they probably have, depending on their job, more organelles that are responsible for that particular job than for another job. Whereas before, they had to do everything, and all the organelles had to do everything. Maybe now certain cells take on certain personalities that's reflected in the organelles that they have.
Drepung denzo so ane tumu mai be laga chedin ke ane chele ba cha do du zambala ane chele ba de da dewa yobe ke ane nanglo ke wangta denzo ane sugres nyagres di mai be ke ane wangta sugre vesla na ane sad sumares di nyunyu mi shungui mares specialization na ane ko ke laga di ane tigar soyni chele ba ina Drepung di ko nangla rabu thai su sugri ma do ke ane nuge wangta dende soyn di mares gozu so 대가나시 타군디 코란기 첼레바디 랭게 조디 카레슬라주 삼바 누바제준 제야 임베나 코그 나로 왕자 예베데 누기 왕자 망수그레스 디마임베 라이부타술라서 와든조 아네 뉴빵게레스 제자 델라 삼발라 첸주르 토네 아네 소수수키 아네 칠레 투모마임바 랭게 로가로가 차도두 삼발라 타군 코란기 나로 고야키 아네 탄다 왕자 든조 임베나야 델라바베케 아네 장가 주루그레스 고주자
So again, the analogy would be, like we talked about yesterday, if one monk is trying to build this room, right? That monk has to be able to do all the different jobs, the electricity, the plumbing, the projectors, the air conditioning, all that. But if you bring in 20 monks, right? And one monk is very good at air conditioning, and that's all he has to do is air conditioning. And the other monk can do the plumbing, right? So all the things required to do plumbing, that monk is good at. Moving a certain way, putting pipes together. And another monk can be the architect and design, right? So you divide this, you specialize, and each monk, the one that's good at the air conditioning, has all the organelles that are really required to be a good air conditioner designer, like that.
제가 다 가서 겐디베 페샤임 바스 제가 겐디바지 아니 컴바디 갸구 요레슬라나 겐디바디 코란 상마 갸구 요레스 로소다 추소다 찍보찍다 춘라당다 대한민국 디나무 프로젝트 란 던지는조 가르도아 제가 던조 상마 소다 장로 소다 상마 갸구 요 손자 아니 디소야키 아니 다 타봉도 힘베네 던조키 아니 왕타 던조 상마 구 요레스 다 디마이 바체 아니 소소소키 아니 레가데 로가 요비메나 땅아 장로 소니이나 nge nanglo la nga thanglo suye ki ani laga chinye ki ani wanta de zomi shi guya maris.
What controls all that inside of a cell is the DNA.
Chesa ta khari ma so do khari nyu so do tangzi che de sure DNA.
So what that means is if you're going to be a cell that does the air conditioning, your air conditioning genes are going to be turned on more in the air conditioning cell than in the cell or the monk that's going to be the architect. His architect genes are going to be turned on more. So at the bottom of the control of all this specialization is which genes are turned on.
Chesa ta dila du sambala ani tabu DNA res DNA nanglo la ani kira lo suya da khangba khorang ki soda charngu cheya da chu suya da dunju changme ki ani rigzis ki nuba de yordas yorwas chesa ta lo sunye yimbe na ani ko lo so du sia lo sunye ki ani thanda wangta sunye ki ani rigzi di ani laga mangas che ko ya di on la du sambala parba sha gu yo wa di mahimbe ke chu suya da khangba sobda sunye ki dunju ani ma ka sha yimba ta ya chu sunye ki lo thanda khangba sobda sunye ki ani rigzi akharsa tabung di yimbe na ko ko nanglo la khangba sobda soya la gowe ki ani wangta tunge ki ani rigze dinzo ani khadu yimbe na ani laga che chu gowe palo thep chu gowe on lai do khunsa partner de gowe tinde chalu res.
So the fancy words for this are, for this specialization, this differentiation controlled by genes, is differential gene expression. That means different genes are turned on.
Chesa ta dela nganjo ane thanji chengyur la yo differentiation ta differentiation different la du sambala ane chebar loga yo ta de imba differentiation la du sambala ane chebar ki ane gwa doya yo be rangshi chesa ta dela du sambala differential gene expression la du sambala gene la na nganjo rigze ro expression la na number 2 dang chesa dela du sambala ane rigze khona ki nanglo la number 2 dela ya ane mandawa yo be ki ne dang mandawa yo be ki ane rangshi this is.
So that means that in this growing stalk, different genes are turned on here, different genes are in these cells, then genes that are turned on in this part of the cell, that these part of the organism and this part, right? So each cell has different genes turned on depending on what it's doing.
Chesa ta kola tabung yore ina ko nang yebe ki tabung de zu ki nang lo rigze khandi nam gyo te ma dun de da Dela yebe chabung nanglo ki rigde ki number twinge di namgyu twinge de swing mense ya dini ani loga cha de yores goju so di imbo sonza ani khola yebe ki chabung dini ani thade cha was.
Okay? Okay, so let's go back, keep running it. So now we're going to go back to the single cells again. And think,
chabung jangbal chisi yabimbe na.
So we still haven't figured out what changes exactly between here and here. Even though we know at the end we're going to get different specialization, we still need to figure out how we got from single cells to multicell.
Da manzo karha gu yor slavim bena konzo chabung de pal loga imba tega nanshi loga inda de ane konzo la dorbe imbena chabung dinzu grig dinzu ane specialized lazima so chele ba chele laga chedeni ke chabung imba wo denishin gu yor ina ya karshin gu yor maras slavim bena deni gifa de jorwala kar yungu yemedi
single cells, right? And then something happens. Single cells, they're all behaving by themselves, and now something changes. The food goes away, there's not enough food, and they start to clump together. They change, they differentiate.
제자다 당문에는 아니 고란 수랑원친 로데요레스 칼라 메오 차와레스 콘주 상마 속바차지 속바차 인도 잠발라 차bun도 소소수기 아니 젤레든조 아니 교루요레스 differential 치기요레스 체준 교루요레스.
So let's talk about what might be happening during those moments.
제자다 딘데기 아니 교르심베기 네갑슬라 체준 교르심베기 네갑슬라 카르카리 용구요레스야 디톨 삼다나.
What do you think is different about this cell and this cell? What do you think changes?
Drepung dida dinini palla ane chawar khariores khandisin jurguyosares.
So we have a single cell like those.
Kodo dindeki ane drepung rawanjin jiores drepung jangba jiores.
Single cells, we take food away.
Khala mewa tangme kapsla.
And now something changes. They all start to come together. So let's see if we can figure out what might be happening.
제자 안에 군주 냠도 대야 고조 로스 냠도 대야 고조 kapsla 군주 나로 갓 용구요사레 딱인다스.
What do you think's happening?
가르차 루두스 텔야 군주 소 용두 잠발라. 가르치기 예베 소로스두스. Increasing in size.
Okay, so over here we're gonna wind up with something bigger. But before that, at the very beginning, what do you think is happening so that this cell realizes there's a change in the environment?
제가 델레 타마 코 델레 사베젤라 코 쳔부차기 와다 임바차시 다 당봉에는 콜라 칼라 메와 차로 칼라 메와 디코 하코 갑슬라 코 나로 하코 디 컨디스 하고 요서레스 하코 갑슬라 코 나로 요와 카두 요서레스 제가 컨디스 가르치겠다 So when he didn't find the food, he will try to find another single cell organism nearby.
Okay, good. So the idea here was, if there's no food, I don't have any food, I need some friends.
제가 nga robot kala ni mindusta nga robot godus lagi na.
So how come they're all coming together here and not somewhere else?
다 robot 제가 누구 예배면 진전도 상만 좀사 듣지 임바 데 하고도 도스. robot 제가 도나 카시 샬도 카시 노도 데 마이바 좀사 데키 카사 시자 숨바들 좀고 도스 카시 데. 한데 사고 오르디 한데 사고 오래. What? 제가 신반도 간에서 렌지 오래 간에서 하고 오래. So maybe one of these single cells they find some food and so he sends some chemical signals around and others they will catch that signal and then they go towards that point.
Okay, so it seems like something is happening first and in one place. Something happens first at that cell, right? And that cell realizes that it's low on energy, low on food.
그래서 다 당문에라 내주기 나로는 내단지라 내주지 중마치 내주 중화디 아니 내주들 칼라 매워 차두고요 세기네 간다면다 가리나 직 중비나.
Good. So that cell realizes that it's low on food and it sends out a chemical signal. Good idea. Right? It sends out a chemical signal to all the other cells, and all the other cells hear the signal and they start responding, right?
그래서 다니엘 예외기 안에 차분 디기 그 가르치는 칼라 라이 마레스 칼라 마라 뒤sam바 당가 칼라 라이 민도 다스 라니 그 갈루레 제루레스 제든조 파 참제 아니 부심바도 저 간레 뒤sam발라 제 참사 카조 디그초라 아니 콘조 로셰그레스.
Okay, so which part of this cell do you think, if it's a decrease in food that causes the cell to send out a chemical signal, which part of this cell do you think is involved in realizing that there's less food?
제가 다 칼라 민두스 잠발라 칼라 메웨기 다데 땅고 두다스라나 디낭로라 차붕기 낭로라 아니 레가 친이드 수인서레스 칼라 메와 당부 추르니드 수인서다 마치 콘지.
Why?
마 뉴지원다 가진 인서레. So in order to produce energy he needs food.
Very good, very good. Because when there's a decrease in food, there's a decrease in the mitochondria being able to make ATP, so there's less ATP. So somehow, when there's a decrease, a big drop in ATP, the cell says, oh, I'm going to send a signal out to my friends. So that signal is called cyclic AMP, or adenosine monophosphate, or cyclic AMP.
Cyclic AMP.
So as you can tell from the name, AMP is related to ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, so it has 3 phosphate groups. AMP just has 1 phosphate group. So these guys are related, so probably that makes sense that the signal for a decrease in ATP is to send out AMP, right? Because these are chemically related.
M is mono?
Mono.
Okay. So that cook subu nanglola ani kala maradu ani cook ze kalu res lavimena ani AMP sayad lures. Ta namgu and zejik miro anzu ATP sayad redo. So that did T let sambala a try let sambala sum lagiro. M let mono let chik mishimia wasonza zedik nanglola ani phosphate let sambala yan duzejik mimba di chik mishimia namgu sumingyo lona nibatunguyo. Ta chik mishimale du zambala ani zedik dad kharcha du yores labim bena ta nuva minduda slag zek dacha yores.
So what we have here is a signal in the environment that the cell translates into, rather a change in the environment, decrease in food, that the cell translates, kind of processes and responds to by sending out a signal to that environment, right?
그래서 다 가르치랬다는 고류그 나올라 안에 내주지 중발에서 다지 레워레스 고류니 단 가르스 라빈베나 칼라민두다스 라게 다드 레워레스 칼라민두다 다드 타분디 서르베캅슬라 타분디 코랑기 안 델라파베키 아니 마 다시 땅버레스 다드 가리기 땅레스 라빈베나 제디 르네 아니 다땅버레스 야 칼라메나 타 디인다스 dichores la che ani dadang yores.
Okay, what changes in these other cells now? So these other cells used to be single cells dancing everywhere, but now they're becoming very focused and they're listening to that call and they're coming to one place. So what changed in them? How do their behaviors change?
Chesa da kono de dadle du sambala dele yewe ke tabun shimba du namgi ani lolo chin de yores pa do su do kora gyan de yores. Ta de lewa da ko kharchi re ta digma sons nyenga du la che ani kanju monjun cham dewa mai ba cho chigla je dal esa dal do shai doas. Chesa da pini thangmung yela du srawa yimbi ne kaps ne ani ta khajo chigla do de ngi ngol gyorso din gyurwe kaps la gyowa di yungya di tabung nang te wi bena tabung nang gyowa khat thep yores kharchi worda di du khat thep na ko ende do dinye de ende do dinye cha du gores mar nyengkha le no shu le ne chimbro cheza din roya la khoran nang gyowa khat do worda de sel khoran nang lo wang tha da dinju ke je shena what Kable Dalen khachur Dalen khachur maybe the receptor cells will change
And how does their behavior change?
Cheza ane nelempa gyo dona ane ko choba khanis gyo duris nelempa da ta kun roya choba de ane ro de gyo so cheza din gyo nelempa khanis sigresti Nelempa lenge kharis. Ayama lagwajang sul lagwajang me. Ya gela inda ya gela. The receptor will receive the chemicals and he will go after the chemicals and then it reaches the source.
Very good. So what happens is you receive the message in a receptor, the cyclic AMP. So all of these friends out there swimming around, they get the message through some kind of receptor, right? That receptor translates that information into movement. It says, now I'm going to move towards where I'm sensing that signal, that cyclic AMP, right?
So that namju khala rawa na shi ana ko thabung du dus do du sambala dela pakwa gang khare yore nelemba de mangbo yoro nelemba chi khal lingis la na gang ki ani thanda AMP se je de ani lingiro de len samba dig chola je rana je de lingiro an thadun dus de fast de la chi rai ro ya di sa du ro de wa cho shamba zul yo maro ani ko dig chol do di chol len le di do di res.
Right, so what I'm drawing here is a representation of this signal going out to these other cells.
Chesa dadi ane dadi cutting use lavi mena tanda zedi dadi AMP zek dadi and dene pa duslo sha yuna dene yungu na yungung de na.
So if you think about it, this signal is going to be most intense, most concentrated, very close to where it's being released from, right? And then as you move away, there's going to be less and less cyclic AMP, right?
Chesa da zedi imbina ko dene le osonza kuriu du changma nanglo le zedi kharshu khoyar mangshu khoyar dela yoro ta dene pa du zambala ko ki ane manyung che de ma cha du ro.
Right, so if I come into the room here, right, and I say, all right, I need some help, I need to build a room out here.
Chesa ta nga go dene ya lan sing ke ya res nga chilol khangpas kya is roba dene go dus la ke ya na.
That the signal is a sound, and this man's going to hear the sound loudest because he's the closest to me. And then people over there are not going to hear the sound as much. In fact, you may not hear me at all.
Chesa di ane dadi ngi ane drag lab ngon du yores. Chesa ngi khan ma thebe ki drag lab ki ane dadi ke shuk che shu surgre sinje ko surgres. Dine pa dona ane digi ane lab di chung neba chung chikina sur dine dik nge dad le todo go mares kola.
So just by chance, if I'm the slime mold cell that needs help, that's hungry, and I send out the signal, just by chance, the cells that are closest to me are going to respond sooner and faster than the cells that are further away.
Chesa danga tanda slime mold na lo yu ki ane tanda simjen ji na nge o da khala ra min du roba godu sladu zambala nge damla gyoshu su yungre konzo yuleres bojo nge la da gyoda konzo yuleres yap dini da ni khudires.
So if these little X's represent cyclic AMP,
제가 얘가 코라기데 아니 구루 카스기 와가지고 노르다스 드네 망고 자셔도 된조 상마 아니 단다 AMPC 딕 제크 다딘다스.
there's going to be more of them closer to where the source of the signal is than further away.
걔라다 코라 아니 용쿵기 네 디다 타니에서 도와라 코라 장가 마 요레스네 파두도 뇽 루루와스.
So that means this cell here is going to bind, is going to receive more cyclic AMP and translate it into movement first and more than this cell here, right?
그래서 다 델리유베 타분지다 델리유베 타분지유비면은 군인이 기치 내len 타분가라 제디 소리야 제디래야라 델마 요레스 델 뇽 요레스.
So these guys are responding first and fastest, and these guys are slower and later.
요 손자 아니 타니에서 뇽 유루도스 아니 요루도스.
And this guy, not at all.
Sursul you do khale mishrum da gan chopla chik da read dos ruor mindos.
Okay? And just make sure you understand this. They're translating what signal into what behavior?
Chesa da dela shin go ya chik yodas. Khari ki da khari ane kunzu ki neju khari ngol pa jurgudus. Shiju khari ngol jurgudu. Da chik le chebal josh du do. Da the kharidu cheba the kharidus. AMP signal
Into?
and the shiju kharing all yurgudu. Shiju lana namjurla movement.
Into movement, right. So in other words, we have to take information from the receptor and translate it into which organelle?
Chesa da dirdas. Chinjenso da de zeg dalle re zeg kharle reslave mena AMP z le das. Z le che ani tabung khorang nanglo ngwa khador slana namgyur shigala chebal ngwa khador na tamung ene de di ani drove ki ngul gyur das. Ojo se shiju de kharin gyur slana gugyu dang res. Ta gung gugyu dang gugyu na ku nanglo ne onda kharle ga chor. Ha? Mai chu konji. Mares Okay,
so I call you, I need some help. So I come into the door, I'm right here. I need some help right away. We need to build something. So you hear me, and then what do you do? If you like me.
Help you.
But what do you have to do to help me? I want to build it.
They have to go out.
You have to get up and move, right? So what does that require?
Energy.
Okay, so it requires energy, so it might require some mitochondria. So you're right. So maybe it does require some mitochondria, but also what I was trying to get you to think is it requires your skeleton and your muscles. So it requires the organelle that these cells are using right now to move is, yes, mitochondria, but also their cytoskeleton. Right, so I'm going to help Ari. So I have to hear the message, the cyclic MP, and then I need to get up. I need to get up and move my bones and muscles, my cytoskeleton, to come here.
peju chiche ani nge ke de kores ke de khoje da ngal roba chindu yo na ani keran so ya lang an rogu yo sonza keran subu ruba da ani shagyu den so gu yo res.
Everybody got that?
Ta hago zos. Yalen de la response yalen ta keran so yalen.
So this is a very, very important basic concept in differentiation and specialization.
Chesa da di ane chengyur da ane tanda chele ke ane ngol la pa gyorbe kapsla ane ramba denzo kesheshur kechimbu yordas da tanya yalen chia da lenya ane delpa yalen chia se ramba denzo kadui na yodi yores.
So what we've just described is called a gradient of a signal. A gradient goes from, in this case, a higher concentration of signal to a lower concentration. That's called a gradient, or lower to higher. So the signal, the stimulus, is always occurring along a gradient.
Chesa da drive kapsla ane da ge ane niva shuk chishu di kora yungkung ki ane sam dene shuk chishu dene pa chung rudo dela du sambal da di da denzo ane chike ze imna ze ge kharze di ane dela tho ane bene pa mar rudo chesa da ze ge kharze tho ane mar doya ki rimba dela nganzu gradient la du sambal kunzu inji thanyo na gradient la ne peju chigres chesa de manyung ge se sig ne khashi ta danda ze ro imna kharze da direk ke jesha yo songa kharze da dene like this.
So if you think about it, this gradient of a signal is very important in determining the behavior, the translation into behavior, right? Because the more signal you get, the sooner and stronger your response is to go towards that signal. So these guys are going to get the signal sooner, and they're going to respond more, they're going to move more and faster than these guys. And this guy over here doesn't get the signal at all, it doesn't move at all.
ane dagi ane shuk chi chung si ne re dagi kharje chewa dela pa we ke ane khunzu ki ane yalen chida gyowa du res yalen chida dela te ane khunzu ki ane namgyur chi tendan jora di loga chewa chik duas da khaje shuk cha yo wi mena di chola ane khunzu gu gyu di chol ru duas ane thega na shi ane da yungsa de da tha nyewa dela ane da shuk che shuli yo sonza khunzu yalen che ya din onle yimba maze ane khunzu pa joya di ane gyowa du duas 다 dine pa di niwa de chung chinche yalen che ge te do tiga nang shi chung chinche simjen ko da ya gor chigmin do de do sa ji gang hat do.
And this becomes very important because even though we're single cells now, eventually, remember, we're going to become multicellular. So the ones that respond, depending on when you respond and how much, determines what your specialization is going to be. So this guy is going to get a job that's different than this guy because he gets there sooner. So I'm going to give him a job of one kind. These guys come later, they get a different job. And these guys don't come at all, so they get no job.
Ta gela so. Tinje ko la dale kun so dale zama kunzu yalen chig do. Yalen chine kunzu ko chol pa do shai do. Ta kunzu gyuma ane kunzu gi lengen khar chai re sabu din zu. Ta kunzu thama jela ane jene mo chik chagdu lega lo cha ro. Lega khar te ma de la di ane kunzu de la sungen le male chai res. Guju so ngun lengen din zu ane lega shimbach di jela din zu shimbach chagi osonza ko ngun le re ko jel le re. Tega na shi ane ko gi lengen de maung ba loga cha du. Guju so ta dos legi lega tiki chidu sambala male ni din zu la lega rai ma res. Ko chashi kona chai marwa read susu.
So just like this, we'll go through the analogy. Again, if I want to build something across the courtyard, and I'm going to call all of you to do that with me. So I need some help.
Ta danji ngek pe dranjar das ta ngachilo chik tiga sti udus roba chisho la du zambala.
I mean, right now you're all independent monks doing your own thing, but we're about to change that because we need to do a job as a group.
Ta kiran zo sama tanda susu rawanjen dedingi ki ane gindu bara susu ta la khari no sama susu chedigi ros ina ta dine ma thön sa jela an ngazo nyamne cheri meshi che rawanje che mardas.
So I come in and I give the signal. Okay, guys, I need some help building a little house across the courtyard.
Oh, da chilo kuchingal robas chida spell nga chi so gudu sla che dat tangdungi.
You come first, so you get to me first. So I give you the first job, right?
Kongien guli res ngendamla. 아니 nge khlewa da o kira nge ngal goya khlega thangbo ding nge quality gres
I say, okay, I need you to get some wood. Please go get some wood.
kusi nga thangbo goya khechi shu sing khashi ko do sing lenga ju kira sing chonye inda la gres
Because we can't build the shed if we don't have any wood. Like, I can't give you the job of building the shed until we get the wood.
제가 아니 nge lega di khangba do jain go ma ju ngo nga sing khashi menda di khangba do go hor zoya min dus
So you become a specialist in carrying wood, and all your genes, gene expression for carrying wood, are turned on. So now these guys go carry wood, and they bring more wood, and they go get more wood, and they bring more wood like that.
제가 다 콘주 아니 첼레바 차오레스 첼레바 카르차라스나 싱초잉이 파 싱초잉이 뭐 손상 콘주기 아니 타분 콘주 나놀게 리제디기 카르소기라스나 싱초가 고야라 고베키 아니 ता वांटा सिक्युनिटी चेजु सुगिनोरे दि गोन्येकी अनि रेगदन्जो अनि लेगाचे दिगरेस
And the reason
लेंगें गोना फाडो शिंकी सोयुं फाडो शिंकी रोदिगरेस
the reason they're the wood carriers is they happen to be the closest to me. They got the signal first, so they get here first. So that where they are in space determines where they wind up in time, determines what job they do later.
제가 다 콜레 레가 카라 마라 코고 마음바 랭겐 카차 마차 세야디 녜 담로 ngol le male da tegana shi ngal goya ke lega thangshu di khari me dini tha chu dos ko ngal goya ke lega thangshu di kol ra re khajila na ko ngal tha ni shu da ngendam thangshu le bres
So I give you that job. You go carry wood. The next guys come and I say, okay, you guys are in charge of measuring the wood and cutting the wood to the right size.
oh ta sing ra se jela ya du sha shan ding mar tu gures ti dar gures kiran su sing dom nye da da nye indas le gres nge
So that's your specialty. Whenever the wood arrives, these guys do nothing but collect wood. You guys do nothing but measure and cut it. And the next guys have the hammer and the nails, and their job is to put it together.
oh cheza da ko ki sing kili ro sing ki sabe jela kiran su kharchi re tu jambu su dimi shi shemba chig mares jambu su sa so na an gyablo din thoa da se a khijili res
So your specialists, your genes are only involved in carrying wood. Your genes are only involved in cutting the wood. Your genes are only involved in nailing the wood.
kesa da kiran su ki rigze di sing chue mi shi le ga chig mare kiran su sing tobia da darya mi shi chig mare kiran su se ga ga mi shi le ga chig mares
Etc.
ta di mai ba dine pha ba zi danye da zo khashi kha de ro
Now the guy way back there in the corner, the furthest monk away, he couldn't hear me.
ta pe su le de de ni nge ke khoyo maro tanji
He didn't get my signal, so he stays independent, or maybe he sends out a different signal, but he doesn't even hear my signal.
kesa nge ke kho me wa son za nge chol yung mares quran pe de di res chig china quran jima ya ke tanye de quran quran cha du res
So let's review. What determines which job you get? What determines what you differentiate into?
jargyong indas jargyong thanda she simba de go ne chandu chigar da kiran lega khar ra mara se di khol ra ligdus so whether you reach the signal first or not
So whether you reach the signal first or not, who's going to reach the signal first?
제가 아니 kiran la da thangbo ra mara ros da thangbo su ra gire sul ra gire closest one
The closest one.
ta ni
Right.
shu de ra do
So it all comes down to where you are in space, right? And when it happens. So it all comes down to space and time.
제가 다 된조 상마 아니 거와 열에 가두일은 만줄 계자 시두 삼발라 거와 열에 라두 삼발라 반낭기 계자 다 동바 키랑 고사 심사데 거와 이메 아니 가두일이 두주 원래 말에 계레 시두 삼발라 두기 계자 제가 다 두다 아니 반낭스야 니 토네 아니 제시가 토야 유교 샤디 열레스
Okay, so let's think through this in the case of the slime mold. Let's keep going.
다 단다 아니 슬라임 몰 무트네야 페샤시 아니 단다 데네 파케자 플라마셰 빔베나
Okay, so remember, this guy is me at the door. He sends out the signal, I'm hungry, cyclic AMP. Everybody comes in and forms a big clump, turns into a slug, right?
그래서 단 ngal khala marayo mane khala marawa sonza nge AMP ki zelo wa sonza an nge dram yu gyo zo nge leche thama phang de che an sangma nge dram lewa des nge dram leche an ngandu sangma ane de nyamdu chobo de choche an ngandu sangma jel kharcha resla na nyamdu lega che de nge ki ane Trepung to make it changing Chavares, the mainland slug like this spell dot.
So remember, when this slug forms,
Just a quote to Chavacapsula, Tubicapsula.
where you wind up in the slug depended on how close you were to the initial signal. Let's just say that this was the first guy that sent out the signal, right? So now, where you were in time and space determine where you are in the slug.
Just a that dealer to Sambala. That onion the D in Bina. That onion D any that onion dealer can tamung letter, jelly, dig chebarki, Tamat and the slug, Budik, Nangloni, can subung, gold you, cable you, any sugar you, D any tamung and touch your doors. Here's
the slug. Now, what's different? What kind of cell jobs are different in the slug? What kind of cell jobs are different than in the independent cells?
That's slug like the dusty. That's slug Nanglo, you get taboo than Zoda. Tamung and Rawanji did the Nig taboo the Nini, Chawakarista.
So look at this guy here.
Kunanglo tabu yorwa.
And this guy here came from
Kunzo Kawana Chumbores loving Bena.
these independent cells.
Tamung and Rawanji tabu the Zun Lego imba. The Zun Lego imba. That did a dinner you have tabu to Manda Harchasta. The way they do, where they function.
Yeah, so what are some of the different functions?
Just the Legachitan Chow Manda Chas was Legachita Manda Kande Chasus. Now here the cells are specialized.
Yeah, so
Here they are not specialized.
how are they specialized?
Kunzu Suzuki, any Chele Bajanya Chas was. A Chele Balega Karkari ordinalula. Lagonyanda. Yeah, in the. Some act as a head, some act as a digestive system, some act as a tail.
Did you say head and tail?
Head, digestive system, and tail.
Yeah. So this guy doesn't have a digestive system yet. It's a very simple organism, but the head and tail is very important. In other words, it has orientation. It has what we call axes or directionality. So now there's a front, right, because it's moving in this direction, and there's a back, right? Very good. There's a top and there's a bottom. So it has directionality and things that were very different than a single cell. But it doesn't have any organs yet. That comes later.
당봉에는 코나 처분 장바 임비값을 딩 고래다 디 슈고래 디 토고래 디 강래 디 오래 라면 오초야 명 상만 이나야 다 슬락라 디 콘조 찍차된 삼발라 콜은 고기 차 요되니 슈고 차 요되니 yap가 차 요되니 딩 차 요되니 저레스 이나 콜 탄다 유마 요래라나 유마 요 말다스 노아다 닝다 침바다 유마다 디네 요 말다스
Very good. So these cells somehow know that they're in the front, and these cells know they're in the back. So each cell knows where it is in relation to all these other cells, which is very different than the single cells up there.
제가 다 콘졸라 만타야 카리로스라나 오 강링이도 간주 고인다 삼야치 슈구잉이도 간주 슈구인다 야비잉이도 야비인다 류잉인다 세야 디 고디요레스 니 듄라 디 야블 디요스 딘데게 체주 디 아니 semjen denzo yorebeslana sawa nini o madas.
Yeah, very good. So that means that the gene expression in a front cell is going to be different than the gene expression in the back cell.
제가 딜라도 삼발라 듄리여웨키 에네 타분 든주키 에네 리즈기 남교 든주다 갸블 유니기 타분 든주키 리즈기 남교 든주 디니니 아니 로가인 구로스.
Yeah, so this is kind of the most simple multicellular organism you could imagine. It could just tell the difference between front and back, top and bottom, and it has this special ability to swim and move forward.
제가 다디 에네 타분 투마 레 토베키 에네 젠딩 모브 나로니 레라슈디 코차디 요레스 콜라 얍단 드 띵다 워게 차마도 shimba ani ngonyok mewa cheba medingi cheba shijibu do tigana shi ko an koran dyung cho yosadela ani gugyu dan drotwe yobe niba yodingi chadi yores.
Also, we know that the slug can sense if there's food around or not. And if there is food, it goes back to being single cells. If there is no food, it goes into the stalk and the fruiting body. So some of these guys in here, although they can't do digestion, they must do some kind of sensing about food, and that's translated into what this slug does.
Ta konzula khala juje mala yo mares lo da chimba da juma yo marla so ta kesi do station roje khala cha du zam khala ra so na khaji re yang kon sam tho dur simje su lo do shei ro ha din ne gab la thandu ya ma do che khala ji mara na an kharcha gres lavi bena sabung ne gab ngol gyu du res kenas dinang lo suen che lan gyu do di ngol ni khudi res ta.
And finally, if there's no food still, we have this advanced differentiation where we form the fruiting body with the spores, right there.
Hade sunje la ju sambal sobda dini jordas thamade.
And which of the slug cells become this part of the stem, which become this part, and which become this part, depends on where they are in this slug.
Chesa da sunje dik nanglo la sunje dik ane zawa do dus tongbo dus go dus chesa da dik nanglo le sla khorang ke supu nanglo ne thabung khandi an delam go chagre kangba chagre dongbo chagre sla du zambala tanda dik ne kapsla ani khona khwa yem ra ligre go lo yeve cable yeve shugul yeve chesa del pawe ke ani gan tha churu res.
So think about that. Where you are in this space determines where you are in this space. And where you are in this space depended on where you were in this space. See, so everything comes back to that original signal, that original gradient. In the end, actually relates to where you wind up here, right? Which, as we'll talk about in a minute, is very important.
Chesa da gelan so sabung ne kapsla gola ni thabung du cable ni shugu del ni ko ra ligre slavim bena Koran thangbung yana slug ne kapsla ane slug gola ye cable ye kangba ye dil ra ligre res. Chesa slug ne kapsla ane thabung khaya ruan ji ko gola ye re cable ye re shugu ye re se di ane tome ki yungse ki ane datani ki thabung di ne ane tha nyele Koran din ram ye re gap stil ye re tha ng ye re del tha chu ye res. Chesa da dil du zambala thanda thame ne kap di khari yung mayu se di thangbo ane ne kap del de do chesa da di jela yang kho do shai disla na ane thangbo khandis yemi di jel di ne ran de gan pha chi shi gya shai ros.
It's very important because in this structure here, the only cells that go on and live to the next generation are spores that are hiding in here. All these other cells are sacrificing themselves, are going to die, so that these spores can move on to the next generation.
Chesa da di sabu imbi na di nanglo ne ane ta mirab gemal de thunye ane suen ko ngol ma ne thumye di ko yores la imbi na go di nanglo le mishi yomardas go di mishi mewa sonza ta thabung din zo ane yun thune de di ro chesa da di ma imbi di dongbo da ane kangbo le ki ma sham le yebe ke ane thabung din zo kharchi ki yore shidu yorwas chesa da khonzo de ke chedula ane koran zo kharchi shegu yores la imbi na le dan shegu yores.
So it's very important to realize this, that the cells here, the cells here, the cells here, and the cells inside all have the same genes, but they're used differently. And the reason they're used differently goes back to where they were here.
Chesa da dela yebe ke thabung da dela yebe ke thabung di nanglo yebe ke thabung de zo an thabung yimba chikba tiga na shi khonzo yungse ki ane rigze de chikpa chikya yorwas yina yang kashi mewa cha du goya da kashi shi do ya kashi ne tobya dinzo sangma ne tobda ma dob se di thangbung yana tha khwa chore di kapsla kora khwa yeme.
So each cell in this fruiting body has the potential to be any of the other cells, but only because of where it happened to be in time and space here is the reason that it differentiates and has the job here, which determines whether or not it's going to be sacrificed or be passed on to the next generation.
콘주 거와 차봉 레레 거와 유베 임베나 릭 나로라 자베 찬 치베나 아니 고 누바 상마 찍바 여디기어 와스 이나야 아니 다 데크 나로라 아니 콘주 키 레가디 첸귤 구토니 소소소 제레 로와 차와 손자 리카시 네 투미 리카시 네 마투미 데네 차워레스 제자 다네 투미 차다 네 마투 차 세디 카두 타초레스 라비임베나 코라 당봉을라 안주 루루마 차웨 값슬라 아니 타링동 가져세메 제자 다 타링동 디기 차와 제제 카시 아니 유마 무투네 네데니 카시 네니 딘주고 체들라 소소라 르당도 고니 데데 아니 로가 차심버레스.
Now believe it or not, it's the same for all of your cells. So all of your cells have the same potential to be any of your cells, but because of where they were in time and space, going all the way back to your mother's egg and your father's sperm, it's because of where they were in time and space and where their ancestors were in time and space that those cells are doing the job that they're doing now. But each of those cells has the potential to do any of those jobs because they all have the same genes.
대가난신 찍버지겐 키란수 레다스 키란수 소그 수부 나노 예베키 아니 차봉 데주 상마 당봉엔라 차봉 리 카리 임베나 아니 차토비아 누바요레스 임베나야 당봉엔라 아메키 공아 나로다 아니 파웨키 아니 감카우니 수 디우캅슬라 케라 튜다 네 치라바 찍라 케란 코사데 카와이메 딜토네 카시 아니 고다 카시 강바다 카시 루고다 데네 아니 코라 칠레 로가 요베 차봉 차침버레스.
So this afternoon with Pantelis, we'll talk about how these same principles are applying to the plant seeds that we planted yesterday.
That during ningunja lobsing nanglola game Pantelis koranki and tanda sheshaveki and tanda requesting re rodan denzo dagonganzo per tabshaveki zishing denzo da and kandes cheche jarne sheguiwa zishing denzo nanglola and ran kandes chadewa di tungres.
Well, in 1 hour, we covered kind of the basics, the very basics of development. So we want to spend the last 15 or 20 minutes taking questions on this because this is a lot of information in a short time.
That tuzu ji last ki nanglola sarji any tanda di pirimki and jushi pechewa shesa sonsta.
Okay, thank you.